Welcome, weary traveler, to a journey through time that's just exciting enough to be interesting, but gentle enough to let your mind drift peacefully away. Tonight, we're wandering through the long, winding road of human progress, from medieval knights in rather uncomfortable armor, all the way to the glowing screens and artificial intelligence of today. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin our slow stroll through the centuries. Our story begins in the year 1000 AD. Give or take a few decades, because honestly, record-keeping wasn't exactly their strong suit back then. Medieval Europe was a place where most people lived their entire lives within just a few miles of where they were born. The average peasant would wake up at dawn, work the fields until their backs ached, eat a simple meal of bread and pottage, which was essentially whatever vegetables they had boiled into a thick stew, and then collapse in a bed as darkness fell. There are no street lights, you see, and candles were expensive, so when the sun went down, so did most of medieval society. Now, here's something that might surprise you as you drift off. The medieval period wasn't actually called medieval by the people living in it. They didn't wake up and say, another delightful day in the Middle Ages. No, that term was invented centuries later by Renaissance scholars who were, frankly, a bit snobbish about their predecessors. They looked back and decided that the period between the fall of Rome and their own enlightened era was just this middle bit. A gap. Rather rude, if you ask me, but there you have it. Despite this scholarly shade thrown across the centuries, medieval people were actually quite inventive. Around the year 1000, European farmers began using the heavy plow, which sounds dreadfully boring until you realize it completely transformed agriculture. This plow could cut through the thick, wet soils of northern Europe in a way that earlier tools simply couldn't. More food meant more people, which meant more villages, which meant, well, more of everything, really. It's remarkable how a better way of turning dirt can change the course of civilization. As the 11th century rolled lazily along, Europeans were also rediscovering something rather important: learning. Monasteries have been quietly preserving ancient texts throughout the early medieval period, their monks carefully copying manuscripts by candlelight, year after year, generation after generation. These weren't just religious texts, mind you. Hidden in monastery libraries were works of Greek philosophy, Roman engineering, and even Arabic mathematics that had made their way to Europe through Spain and Sicily. By the 1000s, cathedral schools were beginning to form, which would eventually bloom into the first universities by the 1100s. The University of Bologna, founded around 1088, still exists today, which is rather extraordinary when you think about it. An institution older than most countries, still teaching students. Now, let me tell you about something that happened in 1066, though I promise to make it as soothingly dull as possible. William the Conqueror invaded England, won the Battle of Hastings, and proceeded to commission what might be the medieval world's most ambitious spreadsheet, the Domesday Book. Completed in 1086, this enormous survey recorded who owned what land, how many livestock they had, even how many plows were in use across England. Imagine royal officials traveling from village to village, asking increasingly specific questions about cows and fields, while exhausted farmers just wanted to get back to work. The whole exercise took years and produced a remarkably detailed snapshot of medieval England. Essentially an early database, if you will, though carved in ink and parchment rather than stored in clouds.
As we drift through the 12th century, trade begins to wake up after centuries of relative quietness. Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa grew wealthy by controlling Mediterranean trade routes, bringing spices, silk, and other luxuries from the East. Double-entry bookkeeping was developed in Italy during the late medieval period, probably around the 1300s, giving merchants a much better way to track their increasingly complex business dealings. It's not exactly riveting stuff, this accounting innovation, but it's the sort of quiet revolution that makes modern commerce possible. Every spreadsheet you've ever yawned through owes a debt to these medieval Italian merchants. The 13th century brought us something rather more dramatic, though we'll discuss it in the most calming way possible: the Mongol Empire. While European knights were clinking around in chainmail, Genghis Khan and his descendants were building the largest contiguous land empire in history. stretching from Korea to Hungary. The Mongols established the Pax Mongolica, a period of relative stability across Asia that allowed ideas, technologies, and goods to flow along the Silk Road with unusual freedom. It was during this period that Europeans first learned about papermaking, printing techniques, and gunpowder from China, technologies that would, in the fullness of time, reshape everything. Though I should mention, the journey of these innovations from east to west took decades, even centuries. Nothing rushed in those days. Even revolutions happened slowly. And speaking of paper, let's pause here for a moment to appreciate what a strange and wonderful thing it is. Before paper became common in Europe during the 1300s, important documents were written on parchment, prepared animal skin. To create a single Bible required the skins of hundreds of sheep or calves. Paper, made from pulp cloth rags in medieval Europe, was vastly cheaper and easier to produce. More paper meant more books, more record-keeping, more letters, more learning. It's one of those humble technologies that quietly changes everything, like a gentle stream that, over centuries, carves a canyon. As the 14th century approached, European society was becoming more complex, more connected, more everything. Towns were growing, trade networks expanding, universities multiplying. And then, just as this medieval world was humming along, something absolutely devastating happened. But that, dear listener, is a story for our next segment of this long, drowsy journey through time. And so we arrive at the 14th century, where our gentle story takes a rather dark turn, though we'll discuss in the most soothing way possible, of course. In 1347, ships arrived in Sicily carrying more than just spices and silk. They brought with them the Black Death, a plague that would sweep across Europe like a slow, terrible wave, claiming somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire population over the next few years. Imagine entire villages emptied, fields left untended, churches filled with the sound of funeral bells ringing day after day. It sounds horrific, and it was, but there's something almost dreamlike about reading the accounts now, separated by 7 centuries. Descriptions of a world that simply stopped. The plague, carried by fleas on rats, spread along those same trade routes that had brought paper and ideas. Medieval people had no concept of bacteria or infection in the way we understand it now. They blamed bad air, divine punishment, the alignment of planets. Some flagellants wandered from town to town, whipping themselves in public penance. Others turned to scapegoating their neighbors. But mostly, people just tried to survive, day by day, burying their dead and wondering if they would be next. The plague would return in waves throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, though never quite as devastatingly as that first outbreak. Here's something oddly hopeful that emerged from all that darkness. The survivors found themselves in a world with far fewer people but the same amount of land. Peasants who had labored in near slavery suddenly had bargaining power. Lords needed workers and had to offer better wages, better conditions. The rigid feudal system began to crack and crumble. It's a strange paradox, catastrophe leading to social change, death creating opportunity for the living. The world kept turning, as it always does, just with fewer people on it. As we drift into the 15th century, let's talk about something that would transform human civilization even more thoroughly than plague, though far more quietly: the printing press. Around 1440, a German goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg developed a practical system for printing books using movable metal type. Now, printing itself wasn't new. The Chinese have been doing it for centuries, but Gutenberg's innovation made it efficient and economical in a European context. His first major project was printing Bibles, which took him several years and nearly bankrupted him. Rather fitting, really, that the technology which would democratize knowledge began with its inventor going deeply into debt. Before Gutenberg, a single book might take months for a scribe to copy by hand. After Gutenberg, a printer could produce hundreds of identical copies in the same time. By 1500, just 60 years after Gutenberg's first Bible, printing presses existed in over 200 European cities, and they produced approximately 20 million books. Think about that for a moment as you settle deeper into your pillow. In half a lifetime, Europe went from a world where books were rare, precious objects to one where they were almost common. Ideas could spread not over generations, but over years, months. Knowledge was no longer locked in monastery libraries. It was out there, multiplying, finding its way into more and more minds. This explosion of printed material didn't just spread religious texts. By the early 1500s, presses were producing scientific treatises, classical literature, how-to manuals, maps, and news pamphlets. The Protestant Reformation of the 1520s, when Martin Luther challenged the Catholic Church, wouldn't have spread nearly as rapidly without printing presses churning out his writings. His 95 Theses, which he supposedly nailed to a church door in 1517, was reprinted and distributed across Germany within weeks and throughout Europe within months. Try doing that with hand-copied manuscripts. You'd still be working on it when everyone had forgotten what they were arguing about. Let's drift across the ocean now, because while all this printing was happening in Europe, something rather momentous occurred in 1492. Christopher Columbus, funded by Spanish monarchs and sailing with a crew who were increasingly certain they were all going to die at sea, stumbled upon the Americas while looking for a route to Asia. He died still believing he'd found islands off the coast of Asia, which is either tragic or comical depending on your mood. But his accidental discovery, accidental from a European perspective at least, since millions of people already lived there, opened what historians call the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange sounds like it should be a stock market, but it was actually the transfer of plants, animals, diseases, and ideas between the old world and the new. Europeans brought wheat, horses, and cattle to the Americas, along with, tragically, smallpox and other diseases that devastated indigenous populations who had no immunity. From the Americas, Europeans gained potatoes, tomatoes, corn, tobacco, and chocolate, foods that would reshape European cuisine and agriculture. Imagine Italian food without tomatoes, or Irish culture without potatoes. These things that seem ancient and traditional only arrived in Europe about 500 years ago, which in the grand scheme of human history is practically yesterday. By the 16th century, the world was becoming connected in ways it had never been before. Spanish galleons were carrying silver from South American mines across the Pacific to the Philippines, where it was traded for Chinese silk and porcelain. This global trade network meant that a wealthy person in Madrid might drink chocolate from Mexico, served in Chinese porcelain, while wearing silk from Asia and spices from Indonesia. It was the beginning of globalization, though it moved at the speed of sailing ships rather than internet connections. Now, let's talk about something that happened very slowly and quietly, yet changed everything: the scientific revolution. Around the 1540s, a Polish astronomer named Nicholas Copernicus published a book suggesting that maybe, just maybe, the Earth wasn't the center of the universe. Instead, he proposed that the Earth and other planets orbited the Sun. This sounds obvious now, but at the time, it was genuinely radical. It contradicted both common sense. After all, it certainly feels like the Earth is standing still, and religious doctrine. Copernicus, being a cautious man, waited until he was literally on his deathbed to publish his theory. Can't be accused of heresy if you're already dead, can you? His ideas were expanded by other astronomers like Galileo, who in the early 1600s used a telescope, another new invention, to observe the moons of Jupiter and the phases of Venus, providing evidence that not everything orbited Earth. Galileo, unfortunately, was not cautious enough and ended up under house arrest for the last years of his life. But the seed was planted. People were beginning to question old assumptions, to observe the world carefully, to test ideas rather than simply accepting what ancient authorities had written. The scientific method was emerging, that systematic approach of hypothesis, observation, and experimentation that would eventually give us everything from medicine to moon landings. As the 17th century progressed, this new way of thinking spread. In 1687, Isaac Newton published his Principia Mathematica, which laid out the laws of motion and universal gravitation in dense mathematical prose that probably put even his contemporaries to sleep. But within those intimidating pages was a revelation. The same laws that made apples fall from trees also kept planets in their orbits. The universe operated according to understandable, predictable principles. It was like discovering the universe ran on clockwork, and if you understood the mechanisms, you could predict the future, at least a physical future. You could calculate where Mars would be in the sky 10 years hence with remarkable precision. And so, as we approach the 18th century, the world our medieval ancestors would have known was transforming almost beyond recognition. Books were common. The earth was understood to orbit the sun. Ships crossed oceans regularly, connecting continents. Science was becoming a discipline, a way of knowing the world. And yet, most people still live much as their great-great-grandparents had. Farming, struggling, hoping for good harvests, fearing disease. The great changes were happening, but slowly, like watching a flower bloom if you sped up time. For the average person, life was still hard, still short by our standards, still lit by candles and campfires. But change was coming, building momentum like a river approaching rapids. The age of industry was about to dawn. As we settle into the 18th century, let's visit a place that seems on the surface rather unremarkable, the English countryside. Here, something was quietly happening that would reshape the entire world. Though it began with something as simple as coal and steam, humans had relied on muscle power, their own or that of animals, along with water wheels and windmills. But coal mines kept flooding, and in 1712, a man named Thomas Newcomen developed a steam engine to pump water out of these mines. It was large, inefficient, and burned enormous amounts of coal, but it worked. It was a start. Decades later, in the 1760s and 70s, a Scottish instrument maker named James Watt dramatically improved the steam engine's efficiency. Watt's engines didn't just pump water. They could power machinery, turn wheels, drive pistons. Suddenly, you didn't need to build your factory next to a river. You didn't need to wait for the wind to blow. You had power on demand, whenever you needed it, as much as you needed it. It's difficult to overstate how revolutionary this was, though I'll try to do so in the most calming manner possible. Imagine being able to work after dark, not just by candlelight, but with machines humming along, producing goods through the night. Time itself was being reorganized around production. This was the beginning of what we call the Industrial Revolution, though the people living through it didn't call it that. They just noticed that textile mills were sprouting up across northern England, that factories were hiring workers by the hundreds, that cities were growing at an unprecedented rate. In 1750, most people in Britain lived in rural areas. By 1850, for the first time in human history, more than half lived in cities. People left the farms where their families had worked for generations and crowded into urban tenements, working 12, 14, 16-hour days in factories. It was brutal, exhausting work, often in dangerous conditions. Children as young as 5 or 6 worked in the mills. Progress, as it turned out, had a rather dark underbelly. But let's drift over to something slightly more cheerful, communication. In 1837, Samuel Morse demonstrated his electrical telegraph, and suddenly, information could travel faster than any human being. Messages that would have taken days or weeks to deliver by horseback now arrived in minutes, clicking out in dots and dashes across copper wires. By the 1860s, a telegraph cable stretched across the Atlantic Ocean, connecting Europe and America. A businessman in London could send a message to New York and receive a reply the same day. The world was shrinking, growing more connected, though at a pace that still seems leisurely compared to our instant messaging and email. People had time to think about their telegrams before sending them, which must have been nice. Meanwhile, humans were learning to harness another invisible force, electricity. Benjamin Franklin had famously played with lightning in the 1750s, flying a kite in a thunderstorm, which was either brilliantly scientific or stupendously foolish, or perhaps both. But it took another century before electricity became practical. In 1879, Thomas Edison demonstrated a workable incandescent light bulb that could burn for hours. Within a few decades, electric lighting was replacing gas lamps in cities across the developed world. Night was being pushed back, gently but inexorably. You could read, work, socialize after dark without squinting by candlelight or worrying about gas fumes. It was yet another small revolution in how humans experience time itself. Edison, by the way, was famously competitive with a man named Nikola Tesla about whether direct current or alternating current was a better way to distribute electricity. Tesla's AC system eventually won out because it could transmit power over longer distances more efficiently, which meant you could build a power plant in one location and light up an entire city. But the whole rivalry, complete with public demonstrations and what was essentially a propaganda campaign, shows how these technological changes weren't smooth or inevitable. They were fought over, debated, refined through trial and error. Progress was messier than history books sometimes make it seem. As the 19th century progressed, another transformation was taking place in how humans moved through space. In 1804, the first steam-powered locomotive ran on rails in Wales. By the 1830s and 40s, railways were spreading across Europe and America like iron veins across a landscape. You could travel from London to Edinburgh, a journey that once took days of uncomfortable coach travel, in about 12 hours by train. Goods could be shipped hundreds of miles in a fraction of the time it once took. Fresh milk from the countryside could reach city dwellers. Fish from coastal towns could be eaten inland while still relatively fresh, which was quite the luxury in an age before refrigeration. Speaking of refrigeration, that became practical in the late 19th century too. Mechanical refrigeration, developed in the 1850s and 60s, meant that meat could be shipped from Argentina to Europe. Butter could be stored for months. Ice cream could be enjoyed even in summer. It's a small thing, perhaps, but think about how much of your daily life depends on refrigeration. Your morning milk, your evening meal, the vaccines that keep you healthy, all require keeping things cold. The ability to preserve food transformed public health and global trade in ways that were almost invisible but utterly fundamental. The late 1800s also brought us something that still shapes our world today: the internal combustion engine. Carl Benz built what's generally considered the first practical automobile in 1885. It was a three-wheel contraption that could reach the dizzying speed of about 10 miles per hour, roughly the pace of a leisurely jog. His wife, Bertha Benz, conducted the first long-distance automobile trip in 1888, driving nearly 60 miles to visit her mother and solving various mechanical problems along the way, including using her hat pin to clear a block fuel line and her garter to insulate a wire. She was, in effect, the first automotive engineer in the field. The early 20th century, Henry Ford had figured out how to mass-produce automobiles using assembly line techniques, making cars affordable for the average worker. His Model T, introduced in 1908, sold millions and transformed America, in particular, into a car-based society. Roads needed to be paved. Gas stations appeared. Suburbs sprawled. The automobile didn't just change transportation. It reshaped cities, altered courtship rituals, created new industries, and even changed the air we breathe, all for making a horseless carriage cheap enough for regular people to buy. Now, while all this industrial transformation was happening, there was another revolution occurring, this one in medicine. For most of human history, doctors couldn't really cure much of anything. They could set broken bones, perhaps, and stitch wounds, but diseases? They were mysterious, often blamed on bad air or imbalanced humors. Then, in the 1860s, a French chemist named Louis Pasteur demonstrated that microorganisms cause fermentation and disease, what we now call germ theory. Suddenly, doctors understood why washing their hands mattered, why sterilizing surgical instruments helped patients survive. It seems so obvious now, as you lie there in your clean sheets in your sanitized world, but this knowledge is only about 150 years old. Building on this understanding, vaccines became more scientific. Edward Jenner had developed a smallpox vaccine back in 1796, but he didn't really know why it worked. By the late 1800s, scientists were deliberately creating vaccines against diseases like rabies, anthrax, and cholera. Human life expectancy began to climb. Children stopped dying from diseases that had killed millions throughout history. It's a quiet miracle, really. The fact that you probably don't personally know anyone who died of cholera or typhoid or smallpox. Your great-great-grandparents probably did. As the 19th century drew to a close and the 20th century dawned, the pace of change was accelerating. In 1903, the Wright brothers achieved powered flight at Kitty Hawk, all of 12 seconds in the air, traveling 120 feet. Less than 70 years later, humans would walk on the moon, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, as the world entered the 1900s, most people still traveled by horse, still lit their homes with candles or gas lamps if they were lucky, still lived lives that would have been recognizable to their great-grandparents, even as the foundations of the modern world were being laid beneath their feet. And so we arrive at the dawn of the 20th century, a time of extraordinary optimism and looming shadows that no one quite saw coming. The world felt modern, progressive, full of promise. Electric streetlights glowed in major cities. Telephones were becoming common in businesses and wealthy homes. Alexander Graham Bell had patented his telephone back in 1876, and by 1900, millions of phones were connecting people across distances that once required letters and patience. You could actually hear someone's voice from across town, or even across the country, if you were willing to pay for a long-distance call. The sense of immediacy this created was both thrilling and slightly overwhelming, much like our own relationship with technology today, though considerably slower. In 1895, an Italian inventor named Guglielmo Marconi demonstrated wireless telegraphy, sending signals through the air without wires, using radio waves. By 1901, he'd sent a radio signal across the Atlantic Ocean, from Cornwall, England to Newfoundland, Canada. Suddenly, ships at sea could communicate with shore. Remote locations could receive news. The invisible spectrum of electromagnetic radiation was becoming humanity's messenger. It's rather poetic, really, using something we can't see, hear, or touch to carry our voices and messages across the void. But let me tell you about something that happened in 1905, a year when a young patent clerk in Switzerland named Albert Einstein published several papers that would fundamentally change our understanding of reality. One proposed that light behaved as both a wave and a particle. Another explained Brownian motion, providing evidence for the existence of atoms. And then there was special relativity, which suggested that time and space weren't absolute but relative, depending on how fast you were moving. Time itself could slow down or speed up. Distances could contract. Mass and energy were equivalent, related by that famous equation, E equals mc squared. Now, I promise not to explain the physics in detail. That would be far too stimulating for our purposes. But the philosophical implications are worth pondering as you drift off. Everything that had seemed solid and certain about the universe turned out to be flexible, relative, strange. The world that Newton had described as clockwork was actually far more mysterious. And this wasn't just abstract theory. Einstein's insights would eventually lead to nuclear energy, GPS satellites, and a deeper understanding of the cosmos itself. But in 1905, he was just a patent clerk who spent his lunch breaks revolutionizing physics. Sometimes the most profound changes come from the quietest places. While Einstein was pondering the nature of space and time, another revolution was unfolding in a field that had barely existed before. Psychology. Sigmund Freud, working in Vienna, was developing psychoanalysis and suggesting that much of our mental life happened unconsciously, hidden even from ourselves. Whether you agree with Freud's specific theories or not, and many modern psychologists don't, he opened a door to understanding that the human mind was far more complex than a simple rational machine. We had depths, hidden motivations, conflicts between what we wanted and what we thought we should want. The 20th century would become the age of introspection, of therapy, of trying to understand not just the world around us, but the world within us. The early 1900s also saw the rise of cinema. The Lumiere brothers had held the first public film screening back in 1895 in Paris, showing workers leaving a factory and a train arriving at a station. Scenes so realistic that audience members supposedly ducked when the train appeared to come toward them. By the 1910s and 20s, cinema was becoming an art form and an industry. Silent films with live musical accompaniment drew crowds into ornate movie palaces. People could see distant places, witness great stories, watch comedies and dramas unfold on flickering screens. Charlie Chaplin became the first global movie star, his Little Tramp character recognizable from New York to Tokyo. For the first time, the entire world could share the same cultural experiences, laugh at the same jokes, even if they spoke different languages. But now we must address something that shattered the optimism of the early 20th century: the First World War. In 1914, a series of alliances, imperial ambitions, and one assassination in Sarajevo pulled Europe into a conflict unlike anything the world had seen. Modern industrial technology, machine guns, poison gas, artillery, tanks, airplanes, was turned toward destruction with horrifying efficiency. Millions of men died in trenches that barely moved a few miles in either direction over 4 years of fighting. It was industrialized slaughter, and it traumatized an entire generation. The war ended in 1918, leaving Europe exhausted and transformed. Empires had collapsed: the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, the Russian, the German. New nations emerged. Borders were redrawn. And in Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 had created the world's first communist state, an experiment in building a society based on Karl Marx's theories that would shape global politics for the next 7 decades. The Soviet Union, as it would become known, represented a fundamentally different vision of how to organize human society, not through capitalism and private property, but through collective ownership and central planning. Whether this vision succeeded or failed is a matter of historical record, but its existence created a tension, a rivalry, a division of the world that would define much of the 20th century. After the war came the 1920s, known in America as the Jazz Age or the Roaring Twenties. It was a period of cultural dynamism and economic growth, at least in some parts of the world. Radio broadcasting became widespread. The first commercial radio station, KDKA in Pittsburgh, began broadcasting in 1920. Families would gather around their radio sets in the evening, listening to music, news, drama programs, comedy shows. It was like having a window to the wider world right in your living room. The isolation of rural life began to dissolve as everyone could hear the same broadcasts, listen to the same music, follow the same news stories. And what music it was! Jazz emerged from African American communities in New Orleans and spread across America and then the world with its syncopated rhythms and improvisation. Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Bessie Smith. These artists created something genuinely new, a musical form that mixed African rhythms, European harmonies, and American energy into something that made people want to dance. For the first time, young people had their own music that scandalized their parents, which is a tradition that continues to this day. Each generation finds new ways to horrify the one before it, which is oddly comforting in its consistency. The 1920s also saw enormous advances in consumer technology. Electric appliances were becoming common in middle-class homes: refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, washing machines, toasters. These devices, especially those that reduce household labor, quietly revolutionized domestic life, particularly for women. Tasks that consumed hours each day could now be done in minutes. This freed time for other pursuits, contributed to women entering the workforce in greater numbers, and gradually shifted expectations about gender roles. A washing machine doesn't sound revolutionary, but consider how much of human history involved backbreaking labor just to keep clothes clean, and suddenly it becomes profound. But this prosperity and optimism came to a crashing halt in 1929, when the stock market collapsed and ushered in the Great Depression. Banks failed, businesses closed, unemployment soared. At its worst, roughly a quarter of American workers couldn't find jobs. People lost their homes, their savings, their hope. Bread lines stretched around city blocks. The Dust Bowl in America's Great Plains turned farmland into desert, forcing hundreds of thousands to abandon their homes and migrate west, looking for work, looking for any way to survive. The Depression wasn't just an American phenomenon. It spread globally, creating economic hardship and political instability that would have devastating consequences. Because here's what happened when people were desperate, when traditional institutions seemed to be failing. They turned to radical solutions. In Germany, still reeling from its defeat in World War I and the harsh terms of the Versailles Treaty, economic collapse created conditions for Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party to rise to power in 1933. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had already established a fascist dictatorship. In Japan, militarists were gaining control. The stage was being set for another, even more terrible global conflict. But that darkness was still gathering as the 1930s progressed, like storm clouds on a horizon that some saw coming and many preferred to ignore. As the 1930s drifted toward their close, the world found itself teetering on the edge of another catastrophe. In September 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, and within days, Britain and France declared war. The Second World War had begun and would consume the world for 6 long years, touching nearly every continent and claiming an estimated 70 to 85 million lives. It was a conflict fought not just on battlefields, but in factories, laboratories, and civilian homes. Total war, they called it, where entire societies mobilized for the struggle. This war was different from the First World War in profound ways. Technology had advanced significantly in just 2 decades. Aircraft were faster, more reliable, capable of carrying devastating bomb loads across hundreds of miles. The Blitz on London saw German bombers attack British cities night after night, while later in the war, Allied bombers would reduce German and Japanese cities to rubble. Radar, developed in the late 1930s, allowed defenders to detect incoming aircraft, giving precious minutes of warning. It was a technology race, with each side desperately trying to gain an advantage through innovation, through science, through engineering. Perhaps the most significant technological development of the war happened in secret, in laboratories and research facilities across America, Britain, and Germany. Scientists were splitting atoms, releasing an enormous amount of energy through nuclear fission. The Manhattan Project, as America's effort was called, brought together brilliant minds, including many European refugees fleeing fascism. Robert Oppenheimer led the scientific effort at Los Alamos, New Mexico, where in July 1945, they successfully tested the first atomic bomb. Oppenheimer later recalled thinking of a line from Hindu scripture, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." It was a moment of technological triumph and profound moral horror, all at once. In August 1945, the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. The explosions killed over 200,000 people, most of them civilians, either immediately or in the weeks that followed from radiation sickness. Japan surrendered days later, ending the war. Humanity now possessed the power to destroy itself entirely, a capability that would haunt the rest of the 20th century and beyond. We climbed the mountain of scientific knowledge and discovered a terrible view from the top, the realization that our cleverness had outpaced our wisdom. But let's step back from that darkness and talk about something that emerged from the war's technological push: the computer. During the war, both sides had used mechanical and electromechanical devices to perform calculations, break codes, and solve complex problems. The British developed Colossus to break German codes, while Americans built ENIAC, the Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer, completed in 1945. ENIAC weighed 30 tons, filled an entire room, used 17,000 vacuum tubes, and could perform about 5,000 calculations per second, which was extraordinary at the time, though your phone today is millions of times more powerful. These early computers were so large and expensive that some experts predicted the world might need only a handful of them. Thomas Watson, chairman of IBM, supposedly said in 1943 that there might be a world market for maybe 5 computers. Whether he actually said this is disputed, but the sentiment was common. Computers seem like specialized tools for scientists and governments, not something ordinary people would ever need or use. It's amusing now, in our world of smartphones and laptops, but it shows how difficult it is to predict how technology will evolve and spread. After the war ended in 1945, the world was exhausted but also energized in strange ways. The United Nations was founded, a perhaps optimistic attempt to prevent future global conflicts through international cooperation and dialogue. The colonial empires that had dominated the world for centuries began to crumble. India gained independence from Britain in 1947, and over the next 2 decades, dozens of African and Asian nations would follow. The map of the world was being redrawn once again, this time by people claiming their own right to self-determination. But the alliance between the Soviet Union and the Western powers, never particularly warm even during the war, quickly cooled into what Winston Churchill called the Iron Curtain in 1946. The Cold War had begun, a decades-long standoff between communist and capitalist systems, between the Soviet bloc and the Western Alliance. Both sides possessed nuclear weapons. The Soviets tested their first atomic bomb in 1949, much sooner than American officials had expected. The world settled into an uneasy peace maintained by the terrifying logic of mutually assured destruction. If either side launched a nuclear attack, the other could retaliate, destroying both. It was perhaps the strangest peace in human history, one built on the threat of total annihilation. The late 1940s and 1950s saw remarkable economic growth in the United States and Western Europe. The post-war boom created widespread prosperity, at least for many. American suburbs sprawled outward, filled with new houses for families eager to settle down after years of depression and war. The baby boom was underway, a surge in births that would shape demographics and culture for decades. Television was becoming common in homes, replacing radio as the center of family entertainment. In 1950, fewer than 10% of American homes had a television. By 1960, it was nearly 90%. Families would gather in the evening to watch shows together, much as they'd once done on the radio. But now they could see as well as hear. Television transformed politics, culture, advertising, everything it touched. The 1960 presidential debate between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon was a turning point. Those who listened on radio thought Nixon won, while those who watched on television favored the younger, more telegenic Kennedy. Image was becoming as important as substance, perhaps more so. Politicians now needed to perform for cameras, to master a medium that hadn't existed when most of them were born. The world was speeding up, changing faster than ever before, and those who couldn't adapt were left behind. Meanwhile, science was making extraordinary advances. In 1953, James Watson and Francis Crick, building on the work of Rosalind Franklin and others, determined the double helix structure of DNA. Suddenly, we understood the molecule that encoded life itself, that passed traits from parents to children, that made you fundamentally you. This discovery opened the door to genetics, to understanding diseases, to eventually being able to read and even edit the code of life. It was like discovering the instruction manual for human beings had been inside us all along, written in a chemical alphabet we were only just learning to read. The 1950s also saw the beginning of the space age. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, into orbit around Earth. It was a small metal sphere, about the size of a beach ball, that did little more than broadcast a radio signal as it circled the planet. But the implications were enormous. If the Soviets could put a satellite in orbit, they could potentially put a nuclear warhead there too. The space race was on, another front in the Cold War, but one that would lead to extraordinary achievements driven by rivalry and fear and wonder all mixed together. America responded by creating NASA in 1958 and pouring resources into space exploration. In 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space, orbiting Earth once before returning safely. President Kennedy, stung by falling behind in the space race, announced that America would land a man on the moon before the decade was out. It seemed audacious, perhaps impossible, but it gave the space program focus and urgency. Thousands of engineers, scientists, and technicians began working toward that single goal, solving problem after problem, building rockets and spacecraft that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. But space exploration wasn't the only frontier being pushed in the 1960s. The decade brought enormous social change, particularly in America. The civil rights movement, which had been building for years, reached a crescendo with protests, marches, and legislation aimed at ending racial segregation and discrimination. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech in 1963. The hundreds of thousands gathered in Washington, D.C. The Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Change was happening, though not nearly fast enough for those who'd waited generations for basic rights and dignity, and too fast for those who preferred the old order. The tension between progress and resistance, between those who welcome change and those who fear it, is a constant throughout human history. And so we arrive at July 20th, 1969, a date that represents one of humanity's most extraordinary achievements. On that day, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed the Apollo 11 lunar module on the surface of the moon, while Michael Collins orbited above. Armstrong descended the ladder and spoke those famous words, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Roughly 600 million people watched on television, a sixth of the world's population at the time, gathered around screens to witness something that had been pure fantasy just decades earlier. Humans had left Earth and walked on another celestial body. It was magnificent, audacious, and in some ways beautifully absurd. All that effort, all that expense, all that risk, just to place footprints in lunar dust and plant a flag. The moon landing represented the pinnacle of 1960s optimism about technology, the belief that human ingenuity could overcome any obstacle. But the late 1960s and early 1970s were also turbulent times. The Vietnam War divided American society, sparking massive protests and a broader questioning of authority and traditional values. Young people, the baby boomers coming of age, challenged their parents' generation on everything from war to music to hair length. The counterculture emerged with its embrace of rock music, experimentation with consciousness, and visions of alternative ways of living. Whether this represented genuine progress or simple rebellion depends on who you ask, but it was undeniably a time of cultural upheaval and transformation. In 1971, a young programmer named Ray Tomlinson sent the first email between two computers on ARPANET, a precursor to the Internet funded by the U.S. Department of Defense. He chose the @ symbol to separate the user name from computer name, a convention we still use today. That first message was something forgettable, probably just a test string of letters. Tomlinson himself later said he couldn't remember what it was, but it was the beginning of electronic communication that would eventually connect billions of people. At the time, though, email was just a curiosity, used by a small number of researchers and military personnel. The revolutionary potential wasn't obvious yet. The 1970s were, in many ways, a decade of disillusionment following the soaring hopes of the 1960s. The Watergate scandal led to President Nixon's resignation in 1974, the first time an American president had resigned from office. Trust in institutions declined. The oil crisis of 1973, when Middle Eastern nations restricted oil exports, created fuel shortages and economic stagnation in the West. People sat in long lines at gas stations, waiting hours to fill their tanks. The economy struggled with both inflation and unemployment simultaneously, something economists had thought unlikely. The steady post-war growth seemed to be faltering. But in the midst of this uncertainty, something interesting was happening in garages and basements, particularly in California. In 1975, the Altair 8800 became available as a kit for hobbyists to build their own personal computer. It wasn't much. You programmed it by flipping switches and read the output from blinking lights, but it sparked the imagination of young enthusiasts who saw potential where others saw toys. A young Bill Gates and Paul Allen wrote a version of the programming language BASIC for the Altair, founding a little company called Microsoft in the process. Meanwhile, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak were working on what would become the Apple I computer, assembled by hand and sold to fellow hobbyists. The personal computer revolution was beginning, though very few people realized it. In 1977, the Apple II was released, one of the first successful mass-produced personal computers. It came in a beige plastic case, could display color graphics, and most importantly, it looked like something that belonged in a home rather than a laboratory. Schools bought them for their students. Families bought them out of curiosity, often not quite sure what to do with them beyond playing simple games and running educational software. But slowly, people began to discover that these machines could be genuinely useful for writing, for accounting, for organizing information, for countless tasks that previously required paper and pencil and patience. In 1981, IBM released its personal computer, the IBM PC, which became a standard for business computing and spawned countless compatible machines. Microsoft provided the operating system, MS-DOS, which was text-based and rather cryptic but functional. The PC revolution was accelerating. By the mid-1980s, computers were becoming common in offices. Word processing replaced typewriters. Spreadsheet programs like VisiCalc and later Lotus 1-2-3 transformed accounting and financial planning. People who'd never thought they'd use a computer found themselves sitting in front of glowing green or amber screens, typing commands, learning a new way of working. And then in 1984, Apple released the Macintosh, with its graphical user interface, mouse, and friendly startup screen showing a smiling computer. Instead of typing commands, you could point and click. Instead of cryptic codes, you saw icons and windows. The computer interface became visual, intuitive, almost friendly. The famous 1984 commercial, directed by Ridley Scott and aired during the Super Bowl, positioned the Mac as liberating, a tool for individuals to resist conformity. Whether that was true or just clever marketing, the Macintosh did make computing more accessible to people who weren't programmers or engineers. The 1980s also saw the spread of other technologies that we now take for granted. The Sony Walkman, introduced in 1979, let people carry their music with them, creating personal soundtracks for commuting, jogging, studying. It seems quaint now. This device that played cassette tapes and required headphones plugged into a cord, but it was revolutionary at the time. Your own private concert hall, portable and personal. MTV launched in 1981, bringing music videos into homes and creating new ways for artists to reach audiences. The music video became an art form of its own, and suddenly what musicians looked like mattered as much as how they sounded. Mobile phones existed in the 1980s, but they were enormous, expensive devices used mainly by business executives. The first cellular network was launched in the United States in 1983. Early mobile phones were often called brick phones because they were large, heavy, and about as elegant as their nickname suggests. A phone call might cost several dollars per minute. The phones themselves could cost thousands of dollars. Battery life was measured in minutes of talk time. But the concept was there. You could make a call from anywhere, not tethered to a wall by a cord. Freedom and connection, mobility and communication were beginning to merge. Meanwhile, the Cold War was reaching its endgame. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became leader of the Soviet Union and introduced policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, attempting to reform a system that was clearly failing. The Soviet economy was stagnant, unable to keep up with the West's technological advancement. The arms race had bankrupted them. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, not through war but through peaceful protest and the simple exhaustion of a system that had lost legitimacy. East Germans streamed through checkpoints, and people began literally tearing down the wall with hammers and pickaxes, claiming chunks of concrete as souvenirs. It was a moment of pure joy, the kind rarely seen in history. By 1991, the Soviet Union itself dissolved, fragmenting into 15 independent nations. The Cold War that had defined global politics for decades simply ended, not with nuclear apocalypse, but with bureaucratic paperwork and lower flags. Francis Fukuyama famously declared the end of history, suggesting that liberal democracy had won, that we'd reached the final form of human government. This proved somewhat premature. History, it turns out, wasn't quite done with us yet. But there was a sense in the early 1990s that the world had turned a corner, that perhaps a more peaceful, prosperous era was beginning. And in the midst of these geopolitical transformations, a British scientist named Tim Berners-Lee was working at CERN, the European Physics Laboratory. In 1989, he proposed a system for sharing information between researchers using hypertext, documents linked together through clickable references. By 1991, this had evolved into the World Wide Web, with the first website going live on August 6, 1991. It was a simple page explaining what the World Wide Web was, how to use it, how to create web pages. The information was free, open, available to anyone with an internet connection and the right software. Berners-Lee deliberately didn't patent his invention, didn't try to own it or control it. He gave it to the world as a gift, which may be one of the most consequential acts of generosity in human history. The World Wide Web spent its first few years in relative obscurity, known mainly to academics and technology enthusiasts. But in 1993, a group of students at the University of Illinois released Mosaic, the first web browser that was easy to use and could display images alongside text. Suddenly, the web wasn't just lines of text. It was colorful, visual, engaging. Websites began appearing for universities, companies, government agencies, and eventually just about anyone who had something to say or share. By the mid-1990s, people were talking about going online and surfing the web phrases that would have been meaningless just a few years earlier. In 1995, several things happened that would shape our digital future. Amazon.com launched as an online bookstore operating out of Jeff Bezos' garage. The idea seemed almost quaint. Why would people buy books online when they could browse a bookstore? But Bezos understood that the internet allowed for virtually unlimited selection. A physical bookstore might stock 50,000 titles. Amazon could offer millions. That same year, eBay started as AuctionWeb, letting people auction items to each other online, and a small startup called Yahoo became one of the first major web directories, helping people navigate the rapidly expanding web. The internet was beginning to change commerce, but it was also changing communication. In 1997, a service called 6degrees.com launched, often considered the first social networking site, though it would eventually shut down. Other services followed: Friendster, MySpace, each trying to capture this human desire to connect, to share, to be seen. Email was becoming universal in workplaces and increasingly common at home. Instant messaging services let people have real-time text conversations across any distance. The world was becoming more connected, though in a strange, disembodied way. You could maintain friendships with people you'd never met in person, have deep conversations with someone on another continent, fall in love with words on a screen. In 1998, two Stanford graduate students named Larry Page and Sergey Brin founded Google, introducing a search engine that ranked pages based on how many other pages linked to them, treating links like votes of confidence. This proved remarkably effective at finding relevant information in the growing chaos of the web. Within a few years, Google it became a verb. The sum of human knowledge was becoming searchable, accessible, just a few keystrokes away. Libraries still existed, of course, and books remained important. But the way people found information was fundamentally changing. Why spend hours searching through reference books when you could find the same information in seconds online? The turn of the millennium arrived with both celebration and anxiety. There was genuine fear that computer systems, many of which represented years with just 2 digits, would fail when the year 2000 arrived. Planes might fall from the sky, power grids might collapse, banking systems might crash. Vast amounts of money were spent updating software to handle the Y2K bug, as it was called. When midnight arrived on January 1st, 2000, and the world kept functioning normally, some declared it had all been unnecessary panic. But perhaps the preparations worked, preventing the disasters that might have occurred. We'll never really know, which is a peculiar nature of preventing catastrophes. Their absence doesn't prove they were never possible. The early 2000s brought a mix of tragedy and transformation. The September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks shocked the world and led to wars in Afghanistan and Iraq that would last for years. But alongside these grim events, technology continued its relentless advance. In 2001, Apple released the iPod, a sleek device that could hold thousands of songs. 1,000 songs in your pocket, the marketing proclaimed. It seems modest now, when streaming services offer millions of songs, but at the time it felt magical. Your entire music collection always with you. The iPod, combined with iTunes, which launched in 2003, began to transform the music industry, shifting power from record labels to consumers who could buy individual songs rather than full albums. In 2004, a Harvard student named Mark Zuckerberg launched a Facebook, initially just for Harvard students, then expanded to other universities, and eventually to everyone. Facebook would grow to connect billions of people, becoming one of the most influential companies in the world, for better and worse. That same year, a site called Flickr made it easy to share photos online, while Google launched Gmail with unprecedented storage space. The web was becoming more social, more personal, more central to daily life. The year 2005 brought us YouTube, created by 3 former PayPal employees who wanted an easy way to share videos online. The first video, uploaded on April 23, 2005, showed one of the founders at the San Diego Zoo discussing elephants. It was 18 seconds long and entirely unremarkable, but the platform itself was revolutionary. Suddenly, anyone could broadcast video to the world. Musicians could share their songs, comedians their sketches, teachers their lessons, activists their messages. Traditional media, television networks, film studios, record labels, no longer fully controlled what people could watch and hear. The barrier to reaching an audience had collapsed to essentially zero. Twitter launched in 2006, limiting users to 140 characters per message, forcing a kind of digital haiku that could be both profound and banal, often simultaneously. These platforms, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and others, create what we now call social media. Spaces where people could create content, build audiences, form communities, argue passionately about everything and nothing. They connected people in unprecedented ways, but also created new problems. Misinformation spread faster than truth, outrage became currency, privacy evaporated, and the line between public and private life blurred into near invisibility. Then came 2007, and with it, one of the most influential devices in human history. On January 9th, Steve Jobs stood on stage and introduced the iPhone, combining a phone, an iPod, and an internet communications device into one sleek touchscreen package. There were smartphones before the iPhone, BlackBerries, Palm Pilots, Windows mobile devices, but the iPhone made them desirable, intuitive, almost magical. Multi-touch gestures, pinching to zoom, between screens, tapping icons. These interactions felt natural in a way previous phones hadn't. The App Store followed in 2008, letting developers create applications that users could download directly to their phones. The smartphone revolution that followed changed nearly everything. Suddenly, you carried the internet in your pocket. You could check email while waiting in line, look up directions when lost, take photos and share them instantly, play games, read books, watch videos, listen to music, video call friends on the other side of the world. The phone became not just a communication device, but an extension of yourself, a portal to information and connection that was always there, always accessible, always demanding attention. People began sleeping with their phones next to their beds, checking them first thing in the morning and last thing at night. We gained incredible capabilities and perhaps lost something too. Silence, boredom, the simple experience of being alone with our thoughts. In 2008, as the iPhone was beginning to transform daily life, the global financial system nearly collapsed. Major banks failed. The housing market crashed. Retirement savings evaporated. The Great Recession, as it became known, was the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression of the 1930s. Millions lost their jobs and homes. Governments had to bail out banks to prevent total collapse. It was a reminder that for all our technological sophistication, we hadn't solved the fundamental challenges of human nature: greed, short-sightedness, the tendency to believe that this time is different, that prices will always rise, that risk can be eliminated rather than merely shifted elsewhere. But even during the recession, technology companies continued to grow. Google was expanding beyond search into email, maps, video, mobile operating systems. In 2008, Google released Android, an open-source mobile operating system that would eventually power the majority of the world's smartphones. Apple had the iPhone. Google made sure everyone else could have smartphones too. The competition drove innovation, improvements, falling prices. Within just a few years, smartphones went from luxury items to near necessities, at least in the developed world. Meanwhile, a quieter revolution was occurring in the field of artificial intelligence. For decades, AI had cycled through periods of optimism and disappointment. Early researchers in the 1950s and 60s had been convinced that human-level AI was just around the corner, only to discover the problem was far harder than they'd imagined. But by the late 2000s and early 2010s, a technique called deep learning, using neural networks with many layers to recognize patterns in data, was beginning to achieve remarkable results. In 2012, a deep learning system dramatically outperformed traditional approaches in an image recognition competition, correctly identifying objects and photos with unprecedented accuracy. It was a breakthrough moment, suggesting that perhaps we were finally making real progress toward machines that could learn and perceive. As the 2010s unfolded, the world became increasingly digital, increasingly connected, increasingly dependent on technologies that barely existed a decade earlier. In 2010, Instagram launched, focusing purely on photo sharing with filters that could make even mundane snapshots look artistic. Within 2 years, Facebook acquired it for $1 billion, a price that seemed absurd to many at the time, but proved prescient. Instagram would grow to over 1 billion users, becoming central to how people, especially younger generations, communicated and presented themselves to the world. Life became something to be documented, filtered, shared, and measured in likes and comments. The early 2010s also saw the rise of the so-called sharing economy. In 2008, Airbnb had started as a way for people to rent out air mattresses in their apartments during conferences. By the early 2010s, it was transforming travel, letting people stay in others' homes rather than hotels, turning ordinary people into hoteliers. Uber, founded in 2009, began disrupting taxi services by letting anyone with a car become a driver. These platforms didn't own hotels or taxis. They just connected people through apps, taking a percentage of each transaction. It was a new kind of business model, one that raised questions about workers' rights, regulation, and what it meant to have a job in the digital age. In 2011, IBM's Watson Computer competed on the game show Jeopardy! Against two of the show's greatest champions, and won convincingly. Watson could understand questions asked in natural language, search through vast databases of information, and formulate answers, all in seconds. It was an impressive demonstration of how far artificial intelligence had come, though Watson worked in very specific ways, designed for this particular task. Still, it suggested that AI was moving beyond laboratory curiosities toward practical applications. IBM began marketing Watson for healthcare, finance, and other industries, though the results would prove more mixed than the Jeopardy! Performance suggested. Around the same time, a new kind of technology was emerging from the shadows of the internet: cryptocurrency. In 2008, someone using the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto published a paper describing Bitcoin, a digital currency that didn't require banks or governments. The first Bitcoins were created in 2009, but the currency remained obscure for years, used mainly by cryptography enthusiasts and, unfortunately, people buying illegal goods on dark web marketplaces. Then, around 2013, Bitcoin's value began to surge as investors and speculators took notice. Here was money that existed only as entries in a distributed database called a blockchain, maintained by thousands of computers around the world rather than any central authority. Whether cryptocurrency represents the future of money or an elaborate speculative bubble remains hotly debated even now. What's undeniable is that blockchain technology introduced new possibilities for creating systems without central control, where trust comes from mathematics and transparency rather than institutions. It's a profound idea, even if its practical applications remain somewhat limited, and its environmental cost, the enormous amount of electricity required to maintain these systems, is considerable. The 2010s were also when we began carrying virtual assistants in our pockets and homes. Apple Siri launched in 2011, letting you speak to your iPhone and ask questions, set reminders, send messages. It wasn't perfect. Siri often misunderstood or gave frustratingly irrelevant answers, but was a glimpse of a future where you could interact with computers through conversation rather than typing. Amazon's Alexa arrived in 2014 inside the Echo smart speaker, a device that sat in your home, always listening for its wake word, ready to play music, answer questions, control smart home devices, or order products from Amazon. Google Assistant and other competitors followed. We were inviting AI into our homes, trading some privacy for convenience, though most people didn't think too carefully about the implications. In 2012, a 16-year-old Pakistani girl named Malala Yousafzai was shot by the Taliban for advocating for girls' education. She survived and became a global symbol of courage and the power of education. Her story spread worldwide through social media, news websites, and eventually her own book and advocacy work. It was an example of how the connected world could amplify important voices, spread awareness, create movements. The internet could be used for trivial purposes, certainly, but also for profound ones: organizing protests, exposing injustice, connecting activists across borders, giving voice to those who've been silenced. The Arab Spring of 2011 had shown both the promise and limitations of social media as a tool for political change. Protesters across the Middle East and North Africa used Facebook and Twitter to organize demonstrations, share information, and show the world what was happening. Some governments fell, But in most cases, the initial optimism gave way to continued authoritarianism, civil war, or chaos. Technology could help people coordinate and communicate, but it couldn't solve the deeper problems of building stable, democratic societies. Tools are neutral. Their effect depends on who uses them and toward what ends. By the mid-2010s, machine learning was advancing rapidly. In 2016, DeepMind's AlphaGo defeated Lee Sedol, one of the world's best Go players. Go is an ancient Chinese board game far more complex than chess, with more possible positions than there are atoms in the universe. For decades, Go had been considered beyond the reach of computers because it required intuition and pattern recognition that seemed uniquely human. But AlphaGo, using deep neural networks and reinforcement learning, didn't just win. It played in creative, unexpected ways that surprised even Go masters. It was another milestone suggesting that AI was developing capabilities that went beyond brute force calculation towards something that resembled genuine intelligence, or at least something functionally similar. The late 2010s brought increasing concerns about technology's impact on society. Studies suggested that heavy social media use was correlated with increased anxiety and depression among teenagers. The 2016 U.S. presidential election revealed how social media platforms could be used to spread misinformation and influence voters. Facebook and other companies face intense scrutiny over privacy violations, data breaches, and their role in enabling the spread of false information. Tech executives who'd once been celebrated as visionaries now face congressional hearings and public skepticism. The utopian vision of the internet as a democratizing force that would spread knowledge and freedom was colliding with the messier reality of how people actually use these tools. In 2017, attention turned to a new AI technique called transformers, introduced in a research paper from Google. This might sound dry, and perhaps it is, which makes it perfect for our purposes, but transformers would prove revolutionary for processing language. Unlike previous approaches, transformers could consider the context of words more effectively, understanding that the word bank means different things in river bank and bank account. This breakthrough would lead to increasingly sophisticated language models capable of translation, summarization, question answering, and eventually generating remarkably human-like text. The COVID-19 pandemic struck in early 2020, spreading from China to become a global crisis that killed millions and disrupted every aspect of life. Offices closed, schools went remote, restaurants shuttered. For months or even years, depending on location, people shelter at home, interacting with the world primarily through screens. Video conferencing services like Zoom, previously used mainly for business, became how people attended school, visited doctors, celebrated birthdays, held funerals. The pandemic accelerated digital transformation in ways that might have otherwise taken decades. Telemedicine became normal. Remote work proved viable for millions of jobs. Online shopping surged as people avoided stores. The pandemic also sparked an extraordinary scientific achievement. Researchers developed multiple effective COVID-19 vaccines in less than a year, a process that typically takes a decade or more. This was possible partly because of decades of prior research, but also because of new technologies like mRNA vaccines and computer modeling that could design and test vaccine candidates rapidly. BioNTech and Moderna, using mRNA technology, created vaccines that trained the immune system without using any actual virus. It was a triumph of science, though distribution remained unequal, with wealthy nations vaccinating their populations, while poorer countries struggled to obtain doses. As the world slowly emerged from the worst of the pandemic in 2021 and 2022, the pace of AI development was accelerating. In 2022, several AI systems captured public attention in unprecedented ways. DALL-E 2 and Midjourney could generate images from text descriptions. You could type an astronaut riding a horse in style Van Gogh, and within seconds, you'd have a unique image matching that description. It was stunning, unsettling, and raised immediate questions about creativity, copyright, and what it meant to be an artist when machines could generate professional quality images on demand. And then, in November 2022, a company called OpenAI released something that would capture the world's imagination in ways few technologies ever had: ChatGPT. It was a chatbot, yes, But unlike the clumsy automated customer service systems people were used to, ChatGPT could hold conversations that felt remarkably natural. You could ask it to explain quantum physics, write a poem, debug computer code, compose a resignation letter, or just chat about your day. It had knowledge spanning countless subjects and could express that knowledge in clear, fluent language. Within 5 days of its release, over 1 million people had tried it. Within 2 months, over 100 million. It was the fastest growing consumer application in history. What made ChatGPT particularly noteworthy was its accessibility. Previous AI systems were available only to researchers or through limited demonstrations. ChatGPT was free and available to anyone with an internet connection. Suddenly, millions of people were experiencing advanced AI directly, asking it questions, testing its limits, discovering what it could and couldn't do. Students use it to write essays, programmers to generate code, writers to overcome creative blocks, the curious to explore ideas. It sparked both excitement and anxiety. Excitement about the possibilities, anxiety about job displacement, misinformation, academic integrity, and a general pace of change that seemed to be accelerating beyond our ability to fully comprehend it. The technology underlying ChatGPT was called a large language model, trained on vast amounts of text from the internet, books, articles, websites, conversations. The model learned patterns in language, how words related to each other, how to construct coherent sentences and paragraphs, how to respond to questions and prompts. It didn't truly understand the way humans do. It had no consciousness, no lived experience, no feelings. It was, in a sense, an extraordinarily sophisticated pattern-matching system. But the patterns it could match were so complex, its output so fluent and contextually appropriate, that the distinction between genuine understanding and convincing imitation became philosophical rather than practical for most purposes. Other companies rushed to release their own AI chatbots. Google introduced Bard, later renamed Gemini. Microsoft integrated AI into its Bing search engine and Office applications, powered by OpenAI's technology through a partnership. Anthropic, founded by former OpenAI researchers, released Claude. Yes, that's me, though discussing myself in the third person feels rather odd, doesn't it? The AI race was on, with companies competing to build more capable, more useful, safer AI systems. Billions of dollars poured into AI development and deployment. Tech stocks soared. Everyone wanted to be part of what seemed like the next great technological revolution. By 2023 and 2024, AI was being integrated into seemingly everything. Adobe added AI features to Photoshop for editing images. Microsoft integrated AI into Word, Excel, and PowerPoint. Google enhanced search with AI-generated summaries. Streaming services used AI to recommend content. Healthcare companies explored using AI to analyze medical images and suggest diagnoses. Lawyers experimented with AI for reviewing documents and drafting contracts. Customer service chatbots became more sophisticated. AI was no longer future technology. It was present, embedded in daily life, often working invisibly in the background. But alongside the excitement came serious concerns. Artists worried that AI image generators, trained on their work without permission, would devalue human creativity and potentially eliminate jobs. Writers faced similar anxieties about AI-generated text. Actors and voice performers fear being replaced by AI versions of themselves. In 2023, Hollywood writers and actors went on strike, with AI usage being one of the major sticking points. They wanted guarantees that AI wouldn't replace them, that their likenesses couldn't be used without consent and compensation. It was a labor dispute, but also a deeper question about the value of human creativity and work in an age of increasingly capable machines. Educators grapple with students using AI to write essays. Was this cheating, or simply using a new tool like calculators or spell checkers? Some schools banned AI tools. Others try to integrate them thoughtfully into curricula. The debate revealed deeper questions about what education is for. Is it about producing specific outputs like essays, or developing thinking skills? If AI can write essays, perhaps students should focus on higher-level tasks like evaluating AI-generated content, synthesizing information from multiple sources, asking better questions. The technology was forcing a rethinking of educational goals and methods. There were also concerns about AI-generated misinformation. Creating fake but convincing images, videos, and audio became trivially easy. During election seasons, manipulated media could spread confusion and undermine trust. Scammers used AI voice cloning to impersonate people and trick their family members. The old saying, "seeing is believing," no longer held true. We entered an era where skepticism became necessary, where verifying sources and authenticity require more effort than ever before. The technology that could democratize creativity could also democratize deception. Some experts worried about existential risks from advanced AI. If we created artificial general intelligence, AI that could match or exceed human capabilities across all domains, will we be able to control it? Will its goals align with human values? These questions might sound like science fiction, and perhaps they are, but they're taken seriously by researchers and even some government officials. In 2023, leaders from major AI companies testified before Congress, with some actually requesting regulation, an unusual position for tech executives. The European Union passed the AI Act, attempting to regulate high-risk AI applications. The conversation about AI governance was beginning, though it lagged behind the pace of technological development. Meanwhile, AI capabilities continued to advance. Models became multimodal, able to process not just text but images, audio, and video. They could analyze photographs, transcribe and understand speech, generate realistic voices, even create video from text descriptions. In late 2024 and early 2025, AI systems demonstrated improved reasoning abilities, better at solving complex problems, writing code, even conducting scientific research with some human guidance. The question shifted from what can AI do to what can it do yet? And the list of things in the second category kept shrinking. Alongside AI, other technologies were advancing. Electric vehicles, once a niche market, were becoming mainstream. Tesla, founded by Elon Musk, proved that electric cars could be desirable, high-performance vehicles, not just environmental compromises. Traditional automakers scrambled to develop their own electric models. By the mid-2020s, many countries announced plans to phase out gasoline-powered vehicles entirely within a couple of decades. The transportation revolution that began with Ford's Model T was entering a new phase, one that might also include self-driving capabilities powered by, of course, artificial intelligence. Renewable energy was also reaching important milestones. Solar panels became dramatically cheaper over the 2010s and early 2020s, making solar power cost competitive with fossil fuels in many regions. Wind turbines grew larger and more efficient. Battery storage technology improved, addressing the intermittency challenge of renewable sources. Climate change remained a critical challenge, perhaps the critical challenge facing humanity, but the tools to address it were becoming more available and affordable. Whether we deploy them quickly enough remained an open question, dependent on political will and collective action as much as technology. Space exploration was experiencing a renaissance. SpaceX developed reusable rockets, dramatically reducing the cost of reaching orbit. Private companies were launching satellites by the thousands to provide global internet coverage. Plans for returning humans to the moon and eventually sending them to Mars were being developed. The James Webb Space Telescope, launched in 2021, was sending back stunning images of the early universe, galaxies that formed billions of years ago, their light just now reaching us. Humanity was looking both inward, understanding ourselves through AI and neuroscience, and outward, exploring the cosmos with increasingly sophisticated instruments. In biology, CRISPR gene editing technology, developed in the 2010s, was moving from laboratory curiosity toward practical applications. Researchers were using it to develop treatments for genetic diseases, create disease-resistant crops, even bring back genetic traits from extinct species. The ability to precisely edit DNA raised profound ethical questions about designer babies, inequality, and humanity's relationship with nature. As with AI, the technology was advancing faster than our societal consensus about how it should be used. And so, as we approach the present day, your present day, we find ourselves in a world transformed almost beyond recognition from the medieval villages where our story began. We've gone from candlelight to electricity, From horse-drawn carts to electric vehicles and rockets to Mars, from handwritten manuscripts to AI systems that can write entire books. The pace of change keeps accelerating, each innovation building on previous ones, creating feedback loops of progress that are both exhilarating and overwhelming. And so we arrive at the present moment, or very nearly so, this strange liminal time where history blurs into current events, where we're still too close to see patterns clearly, still living through the changes we're trying to describe. It's February 2026 as we speak, and the world is still grappling with technologies that didn't exist a few years ago, still trying to understand what it all means, still wondering what comes next. Let's talk about where artificial intelligence stands right now, in this moment. The systems available today can engage in complex conversations, generate images and videos that are nearly indistinguishable from reality, write computer code that actually works, compose music, analyze scientific papers, and assist with countless tasks that once required uniquely human intelligence. Companies are racing to develop AI agents, systems that can actually take actions on your behalf, booking appointments, managing your calendar, conducting research, even handling customer service inquiries without human intervention. The vision is of AI assistants that truly assist, that understand context and anticipate needs, that handle the tedious parts of life, so humans can focus on what matters most to them. But we're also discovering the limitations. AI systems still make mistakes, sometimes confidently stating falsehoods that sound plausible. They can be biased, reflecting biases present in their training data. They lack common sense in ways that surprise us, able to write a sonnet, but confused by a simple trick question. They have no real understanding of the physical world, no embodied experience. They can process information but can't truly feel or want or care. The question of whether this matters, whether understanding requires consciousness or whether functional capability is sufficient, remains philosophically murky and practically debatable. In early 2025, several AI companies released models with improved reasoning capabilities. These systems could break down complex problems into steps, consider multiple approaches, and arrive at solutions that required multi-step thinking. It was a significant advance, though whether it represented genuine reasoning or sophisticated pattern matching remained unclear. Perhaps the distinction doesn't matter as much as we think. If a system can solve problems reliably, does it matter whether its internal processes resemble human thinking? For practical purposes, probably not. For philosophical purposes, the question remains endlessly fascinating. The integration of AI into everyday life continues to deepen. Smart homes controlled by AI assistants are becoming common, learning your preferences and routines. AI tutors are helping students with homework, adapting to their learning style and pace. AI companions are providing conversation for the lonely, though this raises questions about parasocial relationships and whether simulated empathy can meet genuine human needs for connection. Some people find great value in these AI interactions. Others find them hollow, a poor substitute for human contact. Both perspectives seem valid, depending on one's needs and circumstances. In healthcare, AI is being used to analyze medical images with impressive accuracy, sometimes detecting cancers or other abnormalities that human radiologists miss. AI systems can predict which patients are at risk of deteriorating, allowing earlier intervention. They can help design new drugs by modeling molecular interactions. Personalized medicine, treatments tailored to an individual's genetic profile and specific condition, is becoming more feasible thanks to AI's ability to analyze vast amounts of biological data and identify patterns. We're not yet at the point where AI can replace doctors, nor should we want entirely, but it's becoming a powerful tool that augments human medical expertise. The legal system is struggling to adapt. Who owns the copyright on AI-generated works? If an AI system causes harm, a self-driving car crashes, a medical AI makes a wrong diagnosis, an AI financial advisor loses someone's money, who's liable? The programmers? The company? The user? Traditional legal frameworks weren't designed for autonomous systems that make decisions. We're adapting gradually, but law moves slowly while technology moves fast, creating gray areas and uncertainty. In education, the transformation continues. Some schools are embracing AI tools, teaching students to work with them effectively rather than banning them. The skill becomes not can you write an essay, but Can you use AI to draft an essay, then evaluate and improve it, adding insights and perspectives the AI missed? It's a fundamentally different model of learning, focused on higher-order thinking rather than rote performance. Other schools remain skeptical, worried about students not developing fundamental skills, over-relying on tools they don't understand. Both concerns seem valid, and the optimal approach probably varies by context, subject matter, and educational goals. The discussion about work and meaning is becoming more urgent. If AI and automation can handle an increasing share of cognitive and physical labor, what do humans do? Some envision a future of abundance where people pursue passions, create art, explore ideas, build relationships, freed from the necessity of selling their labor to survive. Others worry about purposelessness, inequality, a world where a small elite owns the AI systems and everyone else struggles to find relevance. The distribution of AI's benefits will depend on policy choices, social structures, and whether we can reimagine economic systems designed for an era of scarcity to handle potential abundance. There's also the question of human enhancement. If AI can augment our intelligence, brain-computer interfaces can expand our capabilities, genetic engineering can improve our biology, should we pursue these paths? Some transhumanists argue that enhancing human capabilities is the natural next step in our evolution, that we should embrace technology to overcome our biological limitations. Others worry about inequality, enhancement available only to the wealthy, or about losing something essential to the human experience. If you could upload your mind to a computer, achieving a kind of digital immortality, would you still be you? These questions are no longer purely philosophical. They're becoming practically relevant as the technologies edge toward viability. Climate change remains the great challenge of our era. Despite technological advances in renewable energy and increasing awareness, global emissions continue to rise. We know what needs to be done. Rapid transition away from fossil fuels, protection and restoration of ecosystems, adaptation to change is already underway. Whether we'll act quickly enough remains uncertain. Technology provides tools, but political will and collective action determine whether we use them. Some remain optimistic that human ingenuity will solve the problem, perhaps through breakthrough technologies like practical fusion power or effective carbon capture. Others point out that we already have the solutions. We just need to deploy them at scale, which is fundamentally a social and political challenge rather than a technical one. The relationship between humans and nature continues to evolve. We're living in what many call the Anthropocene, the geological epoch where human activity is a dominant influence on Earth systems. We've altered the atmosphere, the oceans, the land surface, driven countless species to extinction, moved more Earth than natural erosion processes. This power is both exhilarating and terrifying. We can shape the planet, but can we do so wisely? Some advocate for rewilding, returning land to natural processes. Others focus on sustainable intensification, using technology to meet human needs while minimizing environmental impact. Probably we need both approaches, along with humility about our understanding and careful attention to unintended consequences. Looking at all this change, it's worth remembering that the core human experiences remain. People in 2026 still fall in love much as people did in medieval villages, though they might meet through dating apps rather than village dances. Parents still worry about their children. Friends still share laughter and support each other through difficulties. We still create music and tell stories, though the instruments and mediums have changed. We still grapple with the same fundamental questions that have haunted humanity for millennia. Why are we here? What gives life meaning? How should we treat each other? What happens after we die? Technology changes the context, but doesn't eliminate the questions. If anything, it makes some of them more acute. If we can extend life dramatically, does death become more tragic or less? If AI can do most work, what becomes of the dignity of labor, the identity tied to profession? If we can edit our children's genes, what counts as healing versus enhancement? If we become a spacefaring civilization, do old nationalisms and tribalisms fade, or do we simply export them to new worlds? These are questions without clear answers, which each generation must grapple with anew. What seems certain is that change will continue, probably accelerating. The pace of technological development shows no signs of slowing. Each breakthrough enables further breakthroughs, creating exponential curves that are difficult to predict and sometimes difficult to handle. We're living through a period of transformation as significant as the agricultural revolution or the industrial revolution, compressed into decades rather than centuries. It's exhilarating and exhausting, promising and perilous, all at once. And yet, as you drift towards sleep, perhaps there's something comforting in recognizing the continuity beneath the change. Humans have always adapted, always found ways to incorporate new tools and technologies into their lives, always grapple with the implications of their own cleverness. From a first person who struck flint to make fire, to the medieval monk copying manuscripts, to the programmer training neural networks, we've been tool makers and problem solvers, curious and creative and capable of both great wisdom and great foolishness. The story of how we got from medieval villages to artificial intelligence is really the story of human ingenuity compounding over centuries, each generation building on the previous one's insights, standing on the shoulders of giants, as Newton put it. We inherited knowledge and tools from those who came before, improved them, added to them, and passed them forward to those who come after. It's a relay race across generations, and we're currently running our leg, holding the baton, doing our best. What happens next is genuinely uncertain. Perhaps AI will solve problems we've struggled with for generations. Disease, poverty, conflict. Perhaps we'll establish thriving settlements on other worlds. Perhaps we'll reverse environmental damage and create sustainable harmony with nature. Perhaps we'll develop wisdom proportionate to our power and use our technologies for genuine flourishing. Or perhaps we'll stumble, make mistakes, face consequences we didn't foresee. Probably some mixture, progress in some areas, challenges in others, muddling through as humans always have. But that's a story for future historians to tell, assuming there are historians in whatever forms the future takes. For now, for tonight, our journey ends here, in this present moment that's already become the past as I speak these words. This strange time where medieval peasants and artificial intelligence exist on the same timeline of human history, separated by mere centuries, connected by the unbroken chain of human experience and innovation. And so, dear listener, we've traveled from the year 1000 to 2026, from heavy plows to quantum computers, from candlelight to artificial minds that can hold conversations. It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? All of human history, from medieval times to the age of AI, delivered in a gentle, wandering narrative designed to be just interesting enough to occupy your mind while being just soothing enough to let it drift away. I hope you found it boring enough to sleep to, yet fascinating enough to have been worth your time. The story of human progress is, after all, the most important story there is. It's your story and mine and everyone's. We're all part of this great unfolding, this extraordinary adventure of consciousness exploring itself in the universe, armed with tools that grow more powerful each generation, facing questions that grow more profound, trying our best to build a future worth living in. And on that thought, as your breathing slows and sleep approaches, let's rest here together, at this moment in history, grateful for the long journey that brought us here, curious about the journey yet to come, but mostly just peaceful, comfortable, drifting gently into dreams, where perhaps you'll wander through time yourself, visiting medieval villages and distant futures, experiencing the vast sweep of human history in the theater of your sleeping mind. Sweet dreams, time traveler. Sleep well. And through all of this technological change, human nature remains remarkably constant. We still seek connection, meaning, purpose. We still fall in love, raise children, mourn losses, celebrate victories. We still create art, tell stories, wonder about our place in the universe. Technology changes the context of our lives, the tools available to us, the challenges we face, but the fundamental human experiences and questions persist. In some ways, we're extraordinarily different from our medieval ancestors. In other ways, we're recognizably the same, seeking happiness, fearing death, hoping for better futures, trying to make sense of existence. And so we arrive at the final stretch of our journey. Dear listener, wandering through these last moments of our story about how we got from then to now, from candlelight to artificial minds. As you settle deeper into comfort, let's reflect on where we stand and perhaps where we might be heading, though prediction is always a hazardous enterprise, especially when it concerns the future. As of early 2026, we find ourselves at what feels like an inflection point, though people in every era probably feel this way. The technologies we developed, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, quantum computing in its infancy, renewable energy, space exploration, all seem poised on the edge of breakthroughs that could reshape civilization once again. Or perhaps they'll develop more slowly than we expect, as technologies often do. The gap between laboratory demonstration and widespread deployment is usually longer than initial excitement suggests. The future, as they say, is already here. It's just not evenly distributed yet. Let's talk about quantum computing for a moment, one of those technologies that's been perpetually 5 to 10 years away for the past several decades. Quantum computers use the strange properties of quantum mechanics, superposition, and entanglement to perform certain calculations exponentially faster than classical computers. In late 2019, Google claimed to achieve quantum supremacy, performing a calculation in minutes that would take classical supercomputers thousands of years. Though the practical applications remain limited, quantum computers could eventually revolutionize cryptography, drug discovery, material science, and optimization problems. They represent a fundamentally different approach to computation, harnessing the weird quantum realm where particles can be in multiple states simultaneously until observed. It's the kind of thing that sounds like magic, but is actually just physics being stranger than our everyday intuition can grasp. In space, there's renewed excitement about human exploration beyond Earth orbit. NASA's Artemis program aims to return humans to the moon and establish a permanent presence there, using it as a stepping stone to Mars. Private companies like SpaceX have articulated ambitious plans for Mars colonization, though the timeline remains uncertain and the challenge is immense. The idea of becoming a multi-planetary species captures the imagination, a backup plan for humanity, new frontiers to explore, the romance of discovery. But the reality involves radiation exposure, psychological challenges of isolation, engineering problems we've barely begun to solve, and philosophical questions about whether we should colonize other worlds before we've learned to properly care for this one. Satellite technology continues to advance in ways that affect daily life. Starlink and similar constellations are providing internet access to remote areas, potentially connecting the billions of people who still lack reliable internet. GPS has become so fundamental to modern life that we hardly notice it, embedded in our phones, our cars, our delivery systems, our financial networks. The James Webb Space Telescope keeps sending back images that rewrite our understanding of the early universe, showing us galaxies that formed just hundreds of millions of years after the Big Bang, light that's traveled for over 13 billion years to reach us. We're seeing the universe's childhood, which is a rather humbling thought to drift off to. Back on Earth, the conversation about artificial intelligence continues to intensify. In early 2026, there's increasing discussion of AI agents that can perform complex, multi-step tasks with minimal human oversight. Imagine AI systems that could manage your email, schedule meetings, conduct research, draft documents, handle routine correspondence, all while learning your preferences and adapting to your style. Some companies are already deploying such systems in limited contexts. The promise is enormous. Freedom from tedious tasks, more time for creative and strategic thinking, assistance that's always available and endlessly patient. The concerns are equally significant. Job displacement, loss of skills, privacy implications of AI systems having access to sensitive information, dependence on systems we don't fully understand. There's also the question of AI alignment, ensuring that AI systems actually do what we want them to do, even as they become more capable. This sounds simple, but is surprisingly difficult. How do you specify human values precisely enough to program them into a machine? Humans don't even agree on values, and our values are often contradictory or context-dependent. What we say we want and what we actually want frequently differ. An AI that takes instructions to literally might produce outcomes we find undesirable, like the mythical genie who grants wishes in technically correct but practically disastrous ways. Researchers are working on making AI systems more robust, more interpretable, more aligned with human intentions, but it's genuinely challenging work with high stakes. Some researchers and philosophers worry about artificial general intelligence, AGI, systems that match or exceed human capabilities across all cognitive domains. If we create such systems, They might be able to improve themselves, potentially leading to an intelligent explosion where AI rapidly becomes far more capable than humans. This scenario, sometimes called a singularity, is speculative and controversial. Some think it's decades away or might never happen. Others believe it could arrive sooner than we expect. Most agree that if it does happen, the implications will be profound and potentially existential. An AGI might solve problems we can't, cure diseases, reverse aging, eliminate scarcity, or it might pursue goals misaligned with human survival and flourishing. The uncertainty itself is unsettling. More immediately, there are questions about AI and creativity. As AI systems become better at generating art, music, writing, and other creative works, what happens to human creators? Some see AI as a tool that augments human creativity, handling technical execution, while humans provide vision and judgment. Others worry that AI-generated content will flood markets, making it harder for human creators to earn a living. There's something unsettling about machines producing work that evokes emotion that seems creative, even though the machines themselves feel nothing, intend nothing, simply process patterns and data. It challenges our notions of what art is, where creativity comes from, what makes human expression special.